You are standing on the ocean floor. Around you, in the darkness, something impossible rises out of the sediment. Stone walls, streets, the outline of a structure so large it would dwarf a modern city block. And the water above you is 60 feet deep. This is not a shipwreck. This is a city, not a natural formation. This is a city. And according to everything we were taught in school, it should not exist. Most of us learned the same story. Human civilization began around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent. The first cities, the first writing, the first organized societies rising out of a world that had been wild and empty before them. That was the story. Neat, simple, agreed upon, and for a long time nobody questioned it too hard, because the evidence seemed to fit. But here is the problem with that story. It was built entirely on what survived on land. And land is not where the real record is buried. During the last ice age, which ended roughly 12,000 years ago, sea levels around the world were more than 300 feet lower than today. The coastlines of every continent looked completely different. Vast stretches of land that are now underwater were once open plains, river valleys, and sheltered bays. Exactly the kind of places where early humans built their settlements. Exactly the kind of places that have been sitting on the ocean floor ever since, ignored, unexplored, and completely outside the frame of mainstream archaeology. Scientists have known this for decades. The math is not controversial. If early humans followed coastlines, fished, traded by sea, and built near water the way every civilization in recorded history has done, then a massive portion of the archaeological record is sitting somewhere we have never looked. Underwater, and then, off the northwestern coast of India, in the Gulf of Kambat, researchers found something that stopped the conversation cold. In 2001, marine archaeologists conducting a routine pollution survey picked up sonar readings that made no sense. Geometric structures, right angles, patterns that do not occur in nature, spread across nearly 9 miles of ocean floor. When divers went down and brought up artifacts, laboratory dating came back with a number that the scientific community was not prepared to accept. 9,000 years old? Possibly older. That would make it more than 4,000 years older than the oldest known city on Earth. And that changes everything. Here is what they actually pulled up from the bottom of that gulf. Wooden logs, worked and shaped by human hands, carbon dated to somewhere between 9 and 9,500 years ago. Pieces of pottery, hearth material, the kind of ash and carbon residue left behind when people cook food and warm themselves against the cold. Stone tools, the same basic category of implement your ancestors were carrying when they first started organizing themselves into something resembling a civilization. And human teeth. Actual human remains, sitting in 60 feet of water off the coast of India, from a time when mainstream archaeology says civilization had barely begun to flicker. The sonar images told an even bigger story. The structures spread across an area of roughly 9 miles. For context, ancient Mesopotamia's earliest known cities covered a fraction of that. The layout showed what appeared to be a grid, streets running in organized directions, large rectangular formations that could only be buildings, a riverbed running through the middle of the site, now completely submerged, that would have once been a freshwater source exactly where a settlement would need one. This was not a fishing camp. This was not a seasonal stop. The scale and the organization pointed to something permanent, planned, and sophisticated. And then there is the question of the walls. Acoustic images showed structures rising from the seabed with vertical faces and sharp corners. Natural underwater formations do not do that. Erosion rounds things off. Geological processes create slopes, ridges, uneven surfaces. Right angles are a human signature. They mean someone cut stone to a specific dimension and stacked it deliberately. And these walls, sitting in water that has been rising since the end of the Ice Age, had been there long enough to be buried under layers of sediment that took thousands of years to accumulate. The lead researcher on the project, Dr. S.R. Rao, one of India's most respected marine archaeologists, stated publicly that what his team found was a pre-Harappan civilization. something that existed before the Indus Valley civilization, which itself was already considered one of the oldest on Earth. He was not a fringe scientist making a wild claim. He was the same man who had located the ancient port city of Dwarka, also submerged off the Indian coast, and brought it into the accepted historical record. The Indian government sent a second expedition. They confirmed the findings. The artifacts were real, the dating was real, and almost nobody talked about it. Here is the part that should bother you. When those findings came back, when the carbon dates were confirmed, and the artifacts were sitting in a laboratory with numbers attached to them that no one could easily dismiss, the response from the mainstream archaeological community was not excitement. It was not a rush to send more divers, fund more expeditions, rewrite the textbooks. It was something closer to silence. A few published critiques questioning the methodology. Some papers suggesting the artifacts could have been washed in from elsewhere. And then, slowly, the story faded out of the academic conversation and never fully came back. Think about what that means. Physical evidence of a structured human settlement, 9,000 years old, sitting on the floor of a documented body of water, confirmed by a government-funded expedition, reported by credentialed scientists, and the response was a shrug. The reason is not conspiracy. It is something more mundane and in some ways more troubling. Archaeology, like every field built on decades of established consensus, has enormous institutional resistance to findings that require starting over. Careers are built on the existing timeline: textbooks, curriculums, museum exhibits, funding structures. All of it rests on the foundation of a story that begins in Mesopotamia around 3,500 BC. A 9,000-year-old city underwater off the coast of India does not fit that story, and things that do not fit tend to get quietly set aside. But the Gulf of Khambhat is not alone. Off the coast of Japan, near the island of Yonaguni, there is a massive stone structure sitting about 90 feet underwater. It was discovered in 1986 by a diving instructor named Kihachiro Aratake. What he found was a series of huge stone terraces, flat surfaces, right angles, and what appears to be a carved staircase, all cut from a single continuous piece of rock. The structure is roughly 500 feet wide and 90 feet tall. Geologists and archaeologists have argued for decades about whether it is natural or man-made. But here is what nobody disputes. Even if the structure is entirely natural, it was above water during the last ice age, meaning people who lived in that era walked on it, stood on it, and may have built on top of it. Off the coast of Cuba, in 2001, oceanographer Paulina Zalitsky detected an enormous formation of geometric stone structures at a depth of over 2,000 feet using advanced sonar equipment. Perfectly symmetrical shapes spread over nearly 8 square miles of ocean floor. The Cuban government called it one of the most important underwater discoveries in decades. A second expedition confirmed the readings, and then the funding dried up and the project stopped. The same pattern keeps repeating. A discovery, confirmation, silence, which forces a question that mainstream science has not answered cleanly. If we have found multiple sites like this, in completely different parts of the world, all dating to roughly the same era at the end of the last ice age, what exactly are the odds that these are all coincidences? And how many more are down there in the 300 feet of coastline that the rising ocean swallowed whole, in places no sonar has ever reached, waiting for someone to look? Stand at the edge of the ocean and look out at the water. What you are looking at is not just water, it is a filing cabinet. 12,000 years of human history, sitting in the dark, perfectly preserved by cold and pressure, and the complete absence of the one thing that destroys everything on land: time. On land, wood rots, clay crumbles, stone gets buried under centuries of soil and root systems and the slow grind of weather. Underwater, in the right conditions, things stay. The Gulf of Khambhat artifacts came up intact. The wooden logs still held their shape. The pottery still held its form. The ocean is a better archive than anything we have ever built. And here is the number that should stop you cold. We have mapped roughly 20% of the ocean floor. 20%. The other 80% is less explored than the surface of Mars. We have better maps of distant planets than we do of the ground beneath our own oceans. The technology to do deep underwater archaeology at scale has only existed for a few decades, and the funding directed toward it is a fraction of what goes toward land-based sites. We are not looking. Not really. Not in any serious, systematic way that matches the scale of what might be down there. Think about what the existing timeline assumes. It assumes that the first truly organized human civilizations appeared around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, that before that there was nothing worth calling a city, nothing worth calling a society, just scattered bands of hunters moving across empty landscapes. But that assumption was built by people who only looked on land, who only dated what erosion and excavation happened to push to the surface. The underwater record was never part of the calculation, not because it was examined and found empty, because it was never examined at all. Your ancestors were not primitive. They were not stumbling around in confusion, waiting for someone in Mesopotamia to invent the idea of living together. For hundreds of thousands of years they followed coastlines, fished the same waters, built near rivers and bays and sheltered inlets, exactly where rising seas would have buried everything they left behind. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of where we have not looked. Every civilization we know about, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, Greece, all of them appear in the historical record already sophisticated, already organized, already building at scale. Historians call this the problem of the missing prehistory. Where did the knowledge come from? Where did the organizational capacity come from? Where did the engineering tradition come from? The standard answer is that it developed slowly, and we just do not have the early stages yet. But what if the early stages are not missing? What if they are just wet? The city in the Gulf of Kumbat did not come from nowhere. Someone built it. Someone planned those streets and stacked those walls and lived in those structures for long enough to leave behind teeth and tools and the ash of 10,000 fires. They had parents who taught them things, and grandparents who taught those parents, and a tradition of knowledge that stretched back further than any date we have yet been able to assign. They were not a beginning. They were already in the middle of something. And somewhere out there, in 80% of an ocean floor we have never seen, the earlier chapters are still waiting, sitting in the dark, perfectly preserved, completely untouched, holding answers to questions we have not yet had the courage to ask loudly enough. The history of human civilization does not start where we were told it starts. It starts underwater, and we have barely begun to look.